Hey, welcome to 12 Tone, check this out. Sounds cool, right? I mean, I think it does, but I wrote it, so I'm biased. Tell me if it's good in the comments. Or don't. Please don't. Anyway, let's assume for the sake of argument that it's cool. The thing is, though, if you look closely, there's something unusual going on with the notes. The scale I'm using doesn't quite make sense. It's a scale called Messiaen Mode 3, developed by French composer Olivier Messiaen, and it's got this really cool ethereal quality to it, a paradoxical sense of familiar ambiguity. It hasn't seen much use outside of Messiaen's own work, but I think it's neat and it's got a fascinating story behind it, so with your permission, I'd like to talk a bit about why you should care. This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. Normally, if we want to understand the techniques of a particular composer's musical language, we have to rely on analysis. We dig through their work looking for similarities and then build an understanding around what we find. With Messiaen, though, we don't have to do that. He just wrote a book. In it, he lays out in detail the way he thinks about the music he makes, and scholars love a good primary source, so let's take a look at what he says. A big part of his approach is based on what he refers to as the charm of impossibilities. He was interested in the idea of carefully arranging musical structures in order to make certain transformations not work. The first example he gives are non-retrogradable rhythms. Retrograde is just a fancy music term for playing something backwards. Like, if we take this rhythm, we've got a quarter note, 2/8, then 2 more quarters. If we play those same note values but in the opposite order, we get that rhythm's retrograde, and importantly, it's a new rhythm. The two are complements of each other, but they're not the same. The eighth notes have moved. But if we instead take this rhythm, we've got a quarter, eighth, this whole mess is basically a quarter, then an eighth, and another quarter. If we play that backwards, nothing has changed. We have the exact same rhythm we had before. This makes it impossible to tell whether any given statement of this rhythm is being played in retrograde because it sounds the same either way. Technically, we can still play it backwards, or at least we can say that's what we're doing, but it doesn't actually mean anything. The transformation is useless. This happens because, as you might have noticed, the rhythm is a palindrome, or to put it in more precise terms that'll be useful later on, it has reflection symmetry. If we draw a line through the middle, we see the pattern of notes on the left side reflected on the right. The second half is already a miniature retrograde of the first half, so when we flip it, the two just trade places and what you hear is unaffected. Of course, in Messiaen's work, these rhythms were often much more complex. Another fascination of his was ametric music, or music without a consistent pulse, so he could do rhythms like this, but the overall effect is the same. It's still symmetrical, so we still can't play it backwards. Messiaen argues that these sorts of rhythms have a unique charm to them derived from their symmetrical nature. But of course, an audience in a concert hall isn't thinking about retrogrades as they listen to the music. That's not how it works. Most listeners won't even notice a retrograde when they hear one unless it's explicitly pointed out, so the odds of them noticing when one is impossible are very low. But to Messiaen, that wasn't the point. This wasn't an intellectual exercise, it was an aesthetic one. He argued these rhythms have a sort of innate charm, a unity of motion that listeners will find compelling even if they can't identify exactly why. In short, the beauty of these rhythms lies not in the fact that you can't play them backwards, but in the symmetrical structures that make that impossible in the first place. But Messiaen wasn't just interested in impossible rhythms, he also wanted to make impossible scales. Now, there are scales with reflection symmetry. For example, Dorian is a whole step, a half step, 3 whole steps, a half step, and then 1 last whole step. If we take these same intervals and flip them upside down, we get this, which is still Dorian. We've got all the same notes, we're just going the opposite direction. This process of turning intervals upside down is called inversion, so Dorian is a non-invertible scale. There is no upside down Dorian. Which is neat, but inversions weren't that interesting to Messiaen. He doesn't even mention them in his book, and I think that makes sense. When you play a rhythm in retrograde, it's different, but it maintains at least some of the same character. With scales, though, we're so used to thinking of harmony from the bottom up that turning them upside down fundamentally changes them anyway. Like the major scale inverts to Phrygian, and I don't think those sound very similar at all. No, what we want is a transformation we can do to a scale that changes the notes but maintains its basic character, and the most obvious candidate here is transposition, that is, changing the key. If we take G major and move every note up a whole step, we get A major, which has some new pitches, but it's still recognizable as a major scale. In most cases, anytime we transpose a scale, we wind up with some new notes we didn't have before. There is no other major scale that uses all the same notes as G major. Each one is at least slightly different, so we can transpose that scale into 12 unique sets of notes. But what if we couldn't? What if when we transposed it by, say, a major third, we wound up with the same pitch collection we started with? In that case, one could argue that the transposition itself was impossible. Just like you can't invert Dorian and you can't retrograde that rhythm we saw, you'd have a scale that you couldn't transpose, at least not to every key. You'd have, in Messiaen's words, a mode of limited transposition. But how do you set that up? Well, remember how the non-retrogradable rhythm was just a normal rhythm and then its retrograde played back to back? We can try a similar thing here. Instead of building a whole octave-wide scale, we can make a small little cell of just a couple notes, transpose that a bunch of times, and build our scale that way. The most obvious way to do this is with a cell that's just a single half step. If we repeat that enough times, we get the chromatic scale, which is just all the notes, and yeah, you can't transpose it, at least not in standard tuning. That's not super helpful though, it's barely even a scale, so Messiaen doesn't count it. The next most obvious cell is the whole step. If we stack a bunch of those, we get something that looks a lot more like a usable scale. This is Messiaen's mode 1, but it's hardly unique to him. This scale, also known as the whole tone scale, had been used pretty widely by the time Messiaen came on the scene, both by jazz improvisers and by impressionist composers. In fact, Messiaen himself rarely even used this scale because he felt it had already been so thoroughly explored by previous composers, especially Claude Debussy and Paul Dukas. There was, in his mind, nothing more to add, so he didn't try. Hey, editing Corey here from the future. I just realized I probably should have included a demonstration of the limited transpositions somewhere. It's too late to draw them, so screenshots it is. Here's our original mode 1 starting on G. If we move that up a half step, we get a whole new set of notes starting on G sharp. But if we move it up another half step, it's the same notes as the first one, we're just starting on A instead. That's what I mean when I say the transposition is impossible. Okay, back to the drawing board. For our next cell, we need to get a bit fancy. We're going to make a hybrid cell alternating whole steps and half steps for a repeating pattern a minor third wide. That gives us this, which is Messiaen's mode 2. This, again, is a pre-existing scale. Jazz players will probably know it as the diminished scale. It also saw some use by classical composers, most notably Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, but apparently Messiaen wasn't as impressed with those uses as he was by Debussy's because he used mode 2 a lot. And it's a pretty good scale. The alternating pattern of steps gives it more melodic options than mode 1, but the small cell size means its transpositions are still extremely limited. From there, we can just keep expanding our cell. If we do a whole step then 2 half steps, we get mode 3, the first of these modes that really wasn't in common use before Messiaen. This one is, I think, my favorite, and it's the one I used for that piece at the beginning. It has 6 major triads and 6 minor ones, so you have a lot of harmonic options, all evenly distributed through the scale. You have these lovely runs of half steps, plenty of tritones if you're into that sort of thing, and all within this ambiguous repeating structure. You get Messiaen's charm of impossibilities wrapped up in a wonderfully open harmonic playground. It's just a great scale. Beyond that, Messiaen defined 4 more modes, each with a cell size of a tritone. In mode 4, our cell is a minor third, then 3 half steps. Mode 5 uses a major third, then 2 half steps. Mode 6 has 2 whole steps, then 2 half steps. And mode 7 is a whole step, then 4 half steps, which is almost the entire chromatic scale. Messiaen includes these modes for completeness, but he seemed to find them less interesting. His book lumps them all into a single section, and while he did use them all, he tended to prefer the smaller modes. And that makes sense. The large cell size means these last 4 aren't nearly as restricted. Mode 1 has only 2 unique forms, Mode 2 has 3, and Mode 3 has 4, but the rest of them have 6, which is barely a restriction at all. Which brings us to the question of how to use these scales. What are they for? Well, as with any musical device, that's up to you, but there is one thing that makes them unique. They exist in multiple keys at once with the same tonality. If you've got the notes of a major scale, you can only play them as a major scale with one particular root. If you want to change that root, you either need new notes or you need a different scale. But with Messiaen's modes, that's not true. If you've got, say, mode 2, you can play it as mode 2 with any of 4 different roots. This gives you some really cool options. If you want, you can pick one of those roots to emphasize, leaning on notes that are important important in that key while using the others as decoration. That's what I did in the piece at the beginning. The whole thing is centered on G. But you can also not do that. You can drift freely between different possible roots, leaving the tonality unresolved. I mean, you can always create an ambiguous tonality, but here that ambiguity is baked into the scale itself. Even if you do pick a root, you'll always have the option to abandon it, and the structure of the scale means it'll always kinda sound like you're about to. Now, if you're anything like me, you might be wondering if there's any other scales out there that work the same way. Messiaen says there's not. He claims in his book that his list is mathematically complete, that at least in 12-tone equal temperament, these are the only 7 scales with this property, but that's... well, it's complicated. To be fair, he does provide some caveats, like he doesn't include named chords, so the augmented triad, diminished 7th, and dominant 7 flat 5 don't count. And if we want to, we can extend that to any set of 4 or less notes like this. For these purposes, that's a chord, not a scale, even if it's not one with a commonly used name. He also doesn't care which note is the root, so this and this are both mode 3. The new root means the interval structure is a little different, but all the notes are the same with that same repeating cell of whole step, half step, half step, so in at least one sense, it's still the same scale. This may be a little hand-wavy, since as we saw with major and Phrygian, this sort of change can radically alter the emotional character of a scale, but in this case, I think it's probably fine. Again, the whole point is that these are tonally unstable anyway. The big issue is with truncations. Basically, Messiaen doesn't include scales that are just a subset of one of the modes he defined. This isn't one of his modes, but if we add some notes here, here, and here, it becomes mode 3. This means the smaller version is basically mode 3 as well, we're just not playing all the notes. And he's right, if we don't include the chromatic scale, chords, moved roots, or truncations, then his list is mathematically complete, at least for 12-tone equal temperament. But it's actually pretty over-specified. Of the 7 modes he defines, only 2 of them are actually necessary to meet this criteria. Modes 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 are all truncations of mode 7, so the only other one you actually need is mode 3. And that's not surprising because of how these modes work. Remember how the non-retrogradable rhythms worked because they had reflection symmetry? Well, that's not the only kind of symmetry out there, and the modes of limited transposition rely on a different one: rotation symmetry. At this point, it might help to switch from staff notation to a clock diagram. This is where we write all the notes in a big circle, which helps us see the cyclical nature of our scales. If we draw a major scale on here, we see it has no rotation symmetry. That is, there's no way to spin it around and get the same shape. If we move this C up to D and the rest of the notes all move along with it, we wind up with a different arrangement of notes, or at least a rotated one. On the other hand, if we draw mode 1, we do have rotation symmetry. If C goes to D and all the other notes move with it, we have the same thing again. In fact, we can rotate this C to any other note in the scale and still maintain the same hexagon, and each of those rotations corresponds with one impossible transposition. There are 6 places we can rotate to without changing the shape, so mode 1 is like a superposition of 6 different whole tone scales. And the thing is, with 12 notes, there are only 2 basic shapes with rotation symmetry: the augmented triad and the tritone. Every other symmetrical shape can be built by taking one of these 2 and layering it on top of itself. The diminished 7th chord is 2 intersecting tritones, and the whole tone scale is 2 overlapping augmented triads. And from this, we can see why only modes 3 and 7 are actually necessary. Mode 3 is the maximum number of augmented triads you can stack without creating the chromatic scale, and mode 7 is the maximum number of tritones. There's simply no way to create a symmetrical shape that you can't build up into one of these 2 scales because you don't have any other tools with which to build them. So why did Messiaen include the others? Did he just not notice? That seems unlikely. In his book, he acknowledges that mode 5 is a truncation of mode 4, but includes it anyway because it produces a melody he likes. And that, I think, is a clue. Messiaen is, after all, a composer, so his primary concern is musicality. Modes 1 and 2 were already established scales, so leaving them out on a mathematical technicality would have meant sacrificing some really useful insights. Meanwhile, mode 7 is just so bloated that it's hard to use effectively. It's almost indistinguishable from the full chromatic scale. Modes 4 and 6 may be truncations of it, but their more complex interval patterns do a much better job of providing actual musical character, so they're worth including as well. well. And again, Mode 5 has that one melody that Messiaen thinks is neat, so why not toss that in too? Now, is this the most rigorous approach? No, but that's not really the point. The point is to find cool scales to play around with, and in that sense, these other ones definitely seem worth including. So that's how these scales work, but it can be hard to really appreciate them until you actually try to write something in that space, so why not give it a shot? I'd recommend starting with Mode 3, it's got enough flexibility to play around in without losing that clear repeating structure, but feel free to grab any of them and see what you come up with. If you wind up with something you like, send it to me on Twitter, I'd love to hear it. Now, I'll be honest, I don't expect this video to do particularly well on YouTube. I'm proud of it, but it's a relatively obscure topic that most people just aren't gonna care about. I mean, I care, and if you've made it this far, I hope you do too, but it doesn't have that broad appeal the YouTube algorithm is looking for. And that's frustrating, so a bunch of YouTube's top educators got together and decided to build our own streaming platform called Nebula as a place to put the videos we really wanted to make, with no algorithm getting in the way and hiding it from our audiences. Some creators have even used Nebula to develop whole new series. One of my favorite is Story Mode from the folks behind Lessons from the Screenplay, where they take a really thorough look at storytelling in video games, often including full interviews with the game's creators. Personally, I've used Nebula as a place to develop my podcast, Ghost Notes, where I talk about music with my friend Noah, better known as Polyphonic. And the secret trick that makes all of Nebula work is our partnership with CuriosityStream. If you sign up for CuriosityStream with a link in the description, not only will you get 26% off an annual plan, you'll also get a Nebula account free for as long as you remain a CuriosityStream member. We've been working with CuriosityStream for years now, and they've always been super supportive of Nebula's mission. We couldn't have done it without them. So yeah, link in the description gets you access to all of Nebula and all of CuriosityStream, including personal favorites like the documentary Can a Computer Write a Hit Musical, all for less than $15 for an entire year. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Heward, Kevin Wilimowski, and Grant Aldonis. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.